Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to the Real Thread channel. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Today, we're going to be discussing the Screenity video. The story unfolds following the journey of a young woman, a talented but struggling artist yearning for recognition, whose life takes an unexpected turn after a chance encounter. This meeting introduces her to a charismatic figure, an established director known for his avant-garde style and a history of pushing cinematic boundaries, whose early work was deeply influenced by the raw, emotional cinema of the Italian neo-realists. She quickly finds herself drawn into his orbit, seduced by the promise of artistic collaboration and the lure of the sophisticated world he inhabits. The director sees in her a raw, untapped potential, mirroring perhaps the youthful idealism he himself once possessed before the compromises of the industry began to set in. Their initial working relationship is electric, a collision of raw energy and seasoned technique. She begins to pour her own lived experiences, the quiet desperation and fleeting triumphs of an artist navigating a cold, indifferent city, into the roles he crafts for her. As the project progresses, the line between professional respect and something far more complicated begins to blur. The director, accustomed to absolute creative control, starts to exert a controlling influence that extends beyond the set. His methods, once seen as passionately demanding, start to feel manipulative. We see glimpses of his past struggles, perhaps a near miss with obscurity, or a period of creative stagnation that fuels his current intensity, a desperate need to create a lasting legacy through this new muse. The narrative artfully portrays the isolating nature of intense artistic pursuit, especially under the guidance of an authoritarian mentor. The actress, initially empowered by the spotlight, slowly becomes tethered to the director's vision, losing pieces of her authentic self in the performance he demands. There are moments of intense beauty captured on screen, undeniable artistic achievements, yet they are underscored by an increasing tension lurking just beneath the surface of their interactions. The climax of their collaboration seems to bring both artistic triumph and personal reckoning. Perhaps a major festival screening serves as the turning point, where the outside world lauds the product of their union, but the internal cost becomes undeniable. She realizes that while he gave her a platform, he may have also consumed her independence in the process. The film leaves us contemplating the precarious balance between artistic necessity and personal preservation, suggesting that sometimes the most compelling art is forged in crucibles of questionable human relationships. Her final act is one of reclaiming agency, stepping out of the carefully constructed frame he built for her, ready to define her own next scene, carrying the indelible marks of their intense, transformative partnership. The young woman, let us call her Alara, possessed a natural, almost untamed grace, the kind that photographers chase but rarely capture fully. Her early life was marked by the quiet hustle of survival in a sprawling metropolis, her sketchbooks filled not with idealized landscapes, but with the weary faces of commuters and the harsh angles of fire escapes. This authenticity, the palpable sense of being on the outside looking in, was exactly what captivated Julian, the director. Julian, whose reputation preceded him like a carefully curated press release, had made his name in the late 90s by stripping away artifice, inspired by the grainy immediacy of De Sica, preferring authentic location shooting over soundstages. He spoke of cinema as necessary surgery, cutting away the unnecessary layers of Hollywood sheen. When they first met, perhaps at a dusty gallery opening where Alara was serving wine instead of exhibiting her work, Julian didn't see a potential star. He saw a vessel for the truth he felt cinema had abandoned. He mentored her with a fervor that felt like salvation. He would spend hours drilling her on emotional recall, demanding she dredge up moments of profound vulnerability. For Alara, this intense focus was addictive. She absorbed his criticisms like nourishment, believing that every harsh word was a precise chisel shaping a masterpiece. However, Julian's dedication was a double-edged sword. His need for truth meant blurring the lines of privacy. He encouraged her to bring her personal anxieties and unresolved conflicts directly into the performance. During the production, we see the environment shift from an exciting creative incubator to something akin to a gilded cage. Julian's initial admiration morphs into an almost proprietary jealousy. He begins subtly isolating her from her few remaining connections, rationalizing it as protecting her artistic focus. He hints that only he truly understands the depth of the role he has written for her, a role that increasingly mirrors their suffocating dynamic. There is a chilling sequence where he forces her to reshoot a simple emotional scene dozens of times because, in his estimation, her reaction lacked the specific shade of internalized betrayal he felt she owed the narrative. Ilara starts exhibiting signs of strain. The vitality that Julian initially praised begins to thin, replaced by a haunted, brittle quality. She starts dressing in the muted colors Julian favors for his on-screen personas, her own wardrobe choices evaporating. The triumph felt during their early, exhilarating collaborations now seems tainted by the effort required to sustain Julian's grand vision. When they travel for promotion, Julian speaks of her as if she were a carefully calibrated instrument, praising her dedication, which everyone interprets as submission. The true confrontation surfaces not during a dramatic scene, but in a quiet, accidental moment away from the cameras. Perhaps an unscripted encounter with an old friend who points out the hollowness behind her celebrated eyes. This small crack allows Ilara to see the reflection of the artist she sacrificed. The film they create is undeniably powerful, a searing indictment of urban alienation, but she realizes she has become the primary artifact of that alienation. Her final move isn't a dramatic walkout or a shouted argument, but a quiet withdrawal of presence during a major press event. She is still technically present, dressed perfectly in the costume of success, but the spark Julian sought to capture has been deliberately banked. She has given him the performance of a lifetime, but in doing so, she has learned the language of self-preservation, ready now to script her own escape from the director's long shadow. The shadow cast by Julian, once seeming like the shade of artistic shelter, began to feel like an eclipse. Ilara, whose innate talent was rooted in observation, now found her own existence under constant observation, filtered entirely through Julian's demanding lens. Her apartment, which Julian had insisted on redesigning to be more aesthetically aligned with the film's mood, all stark concrete and minimalist furniture, felt less like a home and more like a curated set piece, designed to keep her perpetually in character. This physical environment mirrored the psychological space he had constructed for her. Julian's inspiration often bordered on appropriation. He would recount anecdotes from his youth, moments of near poverty and creative breakthroughs, using them not as cautionary tales for her, but as implicit comparisons where he always stood on the higher ground of experience. He frequently referenced a long-lost collaboration from his early career, a film that was critically adored but commercially disastrous, suggesting that true art demands martyrdom. Ilara, absorbing this mythology, started to see her own exhaustion not as a warning sign, but as proof of her commitment to high art. The pressure manifested physically in Ilara. The quick wit and sharp observations that had initially charmed Julian faded, replaced by a perpetual, low-grade anxiety. There were moments, during intimate script readings late at night, where Julian would switch from the stern director to the paternal confidant, offering seemingly genuine advice about navigating the industry, only to pivot subtly, reminding her that without his guidance, her fragile momentum would vanish. This emotional manipulation was the most insidious part of their bond. He weaponized her own ambition against her desire for autonomy. One particularly telling scene involved a costume fitting where Julian insisted on a dress that constrained her movement, claiming it enhanced the character's feeling of being physically trapped. When Alara politely suggested something more comfortable for the long shooting days, Julian responded with an icy calm that silenced the room. "Comfort," he stated, looking directly at her, "is the enemy of truth. You are not here to be comfortable, Alara. You are here to burn brightly for a moment." That single statement codified their entire relationship. She was fuel for his final great fire. The turning point, subtle as a tremor before an earthquake, occurred during an interview where a journalist asked Alara about her personal contributions to the script. Julian, seated beside her, smoothly interjected, detailing the laborious process of shaping her raw material. Alara felt a distinct, cold shock. The realization that her voice was not only being suppressed, but was being actively rewritten by the man who claimed to see her most clearly. It wasn't anger that filled her then. It was a profound, crystalline clarity. The final festival appearance was the grand theater Julian had built for them. As the applause washed over the screen's conclusion, Alara felt disconnected, watching the radiant, exhausted woman on screen as if she were a stranger. When the time came for the customary joint bow, Alara allowed Julian the spotlight for a beat longer than protocol dictated, a final, deliberate act of deference to his ego. Then, she stepped forward alone to acknowledge the crowd, not with a performance of gratitude, but with a simple, steady nod, her eyes sweeping over the audience, assessing, not seeking approval. She had learned the structure of the frame, and in that moment, she chose not to stand within it, but to step cleanly outside its borders, leaving the director standing alone in the blinding, deserved light of his own creation. The silence that followed Alara's brief, singular acknowledgement felt heavier than any ovation. Julian, usually so adept at commanding a stage, hesitated, his practiced smile faltering as he realized the carefully choreographed symbiosis had been unilaterally dissolved. His face, often described in reviews as possessing a fierce, almost ascetic nobility, momentarily betrayed the sudden vulnerability of a puppeteer whose strings have been cleanly severed. The audience, attuned to the unspoken currents of celebrity dynamics, registered the shift instantly. The narrative they had come to celebrate suddenly splintered into two distinct trajectories. Alara's subsequent actions were characterized by a methodical, almost surgical rejection of Julian's constructed identity for her. She quietly dissolved the lease on the Stark apartment, moving into a smaller, sunnier space filled with mismatched furniture and thriving, utterly uncinematic houseplants, a deliberate reclaiming of clutter and personal comfort. She began sketching again, but the subjects were different now. Instead of the haunting chiaroscuro of the city's shadows, she focused on the quiet resilience of ordinary objects, a worn teacup, the texture of old wood, the unposed interactions between strangers in a park. This work was decidedly unglamorous, possessing a quiet depth that Julian's maximalist aesthetic had always scorned. Her professional reappraisal was equally deliberate. She accepted a role in an independent theater production, a stripped-down piece focusing entirely on dialogue and physical presence, far from the sweeping visual melodrama Julian specialized in. The pay was negligible, the exposure limited, but the environment was democratic. Here, collaboration meant shared effort, not centralized decree. She found herself working alongside actors who spoke of craft with genuine humility, recognizing that the process was as vital as the outcome. This return to basics, to the fundamental act of truthful communication, without the veneer of blockbuster production, began to heal the performative fatigue Julian had instilled. Julian, meanwhile, found his attempts to reassert control futile. His early efforts to publicly frame Alara's departure as an artistic misstep, perhaps a failure to comprehend the necessary severity of commitment, were met with polite indifference by the industry that had grown weary of his increasingly esoteric demands. His subsequent film, lacking the raw electricity Alara had provided, was critically panned as derivative, a pale imitation of his own earlier successes. The industry noted that Julian's genius seemed inextricably linked to the discovery and subsequent exploitation of volatile female talent. Without that necessary chaotic energy, his vision appeared hollowed out. Ilara never sought public revenge or vindication. Her triumph was entirely internal and artistic. She used the hard-won knowledge of manipulation to build stronger boundaries, recognizing the seductive nature of absolute authority in any creative partnership. The indelible marks left by Julian were not scars of defeat, but the deep etching marks that define a signature style, a profound understanding of how light and shadow function, both on film and within the human psyche. She emerged not as Julian's protégé, but as an artist forged in the necessary fire, capable now of generating her own internal light source, capable of directing her own gaze toward the future, unconcerned with the long, fading shadow behind her. The shift in Ilara's creative landscape was akin to moving from a brightly lit but suffocating stage set to an open field under a vast, unpredictable sky. She discovered a quiet joy in the sheer, uncurated act of making things. In her new sun-drenched studio, she began a series of mixed-media pieces that incorporated the very constraints Julian had imposed. Torn strips of expensive, heavy black fabric, reminiscent of the restrictive gowns he favored, were interwoven with coarse jute and fragile, translucent paper, creating textures that spoke simultaneously of bondage and breakthrough. These works were raw, textural journals documenting the topography of her confinement and subsequent escape. Her demeanor reflected this internal restructuring. Where before there was a guarded intensity, now there was a calm, almost meditative focus. People who encountered her professionally noticed the change immediately. She listened actively, never interrupting, but her replies were concise and definitive. She no longer possessed the desperate eagerness to please that characterized her relationship with Julian. She offered her work, defined its terms, and accepted the result without seeking external validation for its inherent worth. This new self-possession was perhaps the most beautiful performance she had ever given, precisely because it required no performance at all. Julian, witnessing this transformation from afar through the increasingly sparse and chilly industry gossip, experienced a bitter irony. He had tried to mold her into a tragic muse, a figure of consuming, beautiful destruction, but she had instead transmuted that tragic energy into a form of austere, practical resilience. His attempts to contact her became increasingly desperate and thinly veiled. Emails, initially professional critiques disguised as concern, devolved into thinly veiled pleas for her to return to the seriousness of true art, often ending with cryptic allusions to their shared, intense past, as if their collaboration were some singular, unrepeatable chemical reaction. One poignant moment captured the finality of their break. Ilara was invited to sit on a small panel discussing emerging directorial voices, an invitation she accepted cautiously. When the moderator inevitably brought up her breakout role under Julian's guidance, Ilara paused, taking a slow sip of water. She acknowledged the film's technical brilliance, crediting the camera work and the power of the initial concept. Then, with devastating subtlety, she added that the greatest lesson she learned from that intense period was not how to act, but how to recognize the precise moment an artistic partnership becomes a form of necessary extraction. She spoke of learning to value the quiet, internal monologue over the deafening external roar, a concept Julian, obsessed with scale and noise, would never comprehend. Her ultimate success lay not in achieving blockbuster fame, but in achieving sustainable creative integrity. She started quietly mentoring younger artists, specifically those struggling with overbearing figures in the industry, offering guidance rooted in boundaries rather than absorption. She taught them the difference between inspiration and consumption. Ilara realized that Julian, for all his technical mastery and avant-garde reputation, had ultimately been trapped by his own mythology, the need to constantly recreate the electrifying tension of a first discovery. She, however, was free to explore the quieter, more enduring landscapes of self-mastery, finding a richer, more sustainable light in the soft glow of her own carefully tended lamp. The shift from the dazzling, suffocating spotlight to the quiet industry of self-directed creation brought Ilara a profound sense of peace, a sensation far removed from the adrenaline spikes Julian had equated with artistic vitality. She found a deep resonance in the tactile nature of her new studio work, particularly when she began incorporating elements of discarded film stock into her collages. These physical remnants of Julian's world, the celluloid strips that once held their shared moments hostage, were now cut, burned, and reformed into abstract mosaics, their glossy sheen reflecting light in fragmented, harmless ways. It was alchemy performed on their past, neutralizing the toxicity through deliberate physical alteration. Her approach to her theater work also deepened. The small stage became her laboratory for authenticity. Free from the need to embody a character designed to fulfill Julian's psychological needs, she explored roles that were structurally complex, but emotionally uncomplicated by manipulation. In one play, she portrayed a stoic scientist grappling with an ethical dilemma, a character defined by intellectual rigor rather than manufactured anguish. The audience reaction was sustained and thoughtful. They weren't merely stunned by spectacle. They were engaged in dialogue. This proved to Ilara that true artistic power wasn't about overwhelming the viewer, but about inviting them in without coercion. Julian, meanwhile, entered a period of visible creative decay. His attempts to replicate the success he'd found with Ilara by finding new, younger talents felt increasingly desperate and hollow. He sought out artists who displayed not the raw potential he'd first identified in Ilara, but artists who were already polished and eager for validation. His directing style became less exploratory and more rigidly academic. He was trying to follow a formula that only worked once, because its essential ingredient, Ilara's authentic, uncompromised reaction to pressure, was no longer available to him. His public appearances grew strained, marked by a defensive insistence that his genius was misunderstood by a Philistine era that valued marketable comfort over challenging truth. The final, almost absurd culmination of their separation occurred when Julian released a retrospective documentary celebrating his decades in cinema. Predictably, Ilara's segment was meticulously framed. She was depicted as a beautiful, fleeting phenomenon, a tragic footnote in his grand narrative of artistic struggle. However, Ilara did not issue a statement or retaliate publicly. Instead, she sent him a single, unmarked package on the day of the documentary's premiere. Inside was one of her recent mixed media pieces, a dense, textured work dominated by warm earth tones and interwoven with delicate threads of gold leaf, the antithesis of Julian's cold, black-and-white aesthetic. There was no note. The package itself was a quiet, irrefutable declaration. She had taken the dark elements he forced upon her and transformed them into something wholly her own, something that shone with its own internal, sustainable warmth. She had not just moved on, she had built a new spectrum of light entirely beyond his control. The finality symbolized by that unmarked package resonated through the industry not as a hostile act, but as a definitive closure, a masterclass in non-confrontational assertion. Ilara's sustained quietude spoke volumes that Julian's manufactured drama could never match. She had learned that the most powerful narrative move is often the one where the protagonist simply decides not to participate in the antagonist's script any longer. She had shed the skin of the muse and settled comfortably into the armor of the creator. Her work in the theater began to garner serious critical attention, not for explosive performances, but for the profound sense of grounded reality she brought to every line reading. Reviewers frequently noted a maturity in her gaze, a complete absence of artifice that made her presence on stage feel less like acting and more like bearing witness. This integrity began attracting a new breed of collaborators, directors and writers, who valued process over provocation, who sought nuance over shock value. They admired Julian's eye for raw talent, but were fundamentally opposed to his methodology of extraction. Ilara, having navigated the treacherous waters of artistic power dynamics, became a quiet gatekeeper against similar abuses. She started sitting in on early development meetings for grants and independent film funds, not seeking directorial power for herself, but acting as an early warning system. Her counsel was invaluable. She could spot the telltale signs of obsessive control masked as artistic passion, the subtle red flags of isolation disguised as protective sheltering. She didn't preach. She simply shared her lived experience as a case study in what happens when genius refuses to respect boundaries. Julian, meanwhile, found himself increasingly confined to the retrospective world he had so desperately tried to immortalize. His reputation curdled. The edgy pioneer became the aging eccentric clinging to past glories. He was eventually passed over for major festival retrospectives because, as one anonymous programmer reportedly noted, his work is inseparable from the drama surrounding its creation, and frankly, we are tired of investing in the drama. His final public appearances were marked by a noticeable bitterness, a sense that the world had failed to appreciate the necessary suffering required for true art, a suffering he was no longer capable of inflicting effectively. The last, unseen intersection of their lives occurred years later. Ilara was visiting a university campus, giving a lecture on sustainable artistic practice. Walking through an older wing of the film department, she noticed a small, retrospective exhibit dedicated to the Italian neorealists, Julian's foundational inspiration. Tucked away in a dusty corner, there was a single black and white still from their controversial collaboration. It was a moment of intense, almost painful vulnerability on her part, perfectly framed, perfectly lit. She paused, looking at the image not with regret, but with a strange sense of anthropological distance. She recognized the beauty in the captured moment, but also the high price paid for its existence. Without touching the glass, Ilara smiled, a small, genuine curve of the lips that held no irony or bitterness. She had taken the blueprint of that pain, studied its construction, and used that knowledge to build a life where such moments of forced extremity were no longer necessary. She turned, leaving the shadow in the glass behind her, stepping fully into the broad, self-authored daylight. The self-authored daylight Ilara inhabited was not the harsh, unforgiving glare of the cinema spotlight, but the diffused, steady illumination of purpose. She had learned that endurance in art was not about surviving the storm Julian created, but about mastering the climate within herself. Her lectures became highly sought after, not because she sensationalized her past, but because she articulated the infrastructure of creative toxicity with clinical precision. She began publishing essays under a pseudonym, dissecting the psychology of the auteur and the seductive nature of submission to a singular dominant vision. These theoretical writings, devoid of personal grievance, offered a vital vocabulary for emerging artists worldwide. Her personal life stabilized into a pattern of quiet fulfillment. She cultivated deep, reciprocal friendships, relationships built on mutual support rather than hierarchical mentorship. She began spending summers away from the city, renting small, functional cottages where the only audience was the landscape itself. Here, she experimented with large-scale installations using natural elements, driftwood, riverstones, woven grasses, creating ephemeral works that celebrated impermanence and natural decay, themes antithetical to Julian's obsession with freezing moments forever onto film. Julian's presence faded into the background hum of industry mythology, a cautionary tale whispered in film schools. He became the archetype of the brilliant artist ruined by his own inability to evolve beyond his initial, volatile methods. Rumors circulated that he had retreated entirely from active production, living mostly off the residuals of his early, boundary-pushing work. His apartment, an increasingly cluttered shrine to a decade that had long since passed. He was a relic of an older, more ruthless Hollywood machinery, a machine that Ilara had skillfully dismantled from within her own career. There was a final, brief echo of their connection that underscored Ilara's ultimate liberation. A major retrospective of Julian's work was mounted overseas, an event he attended with the solemn air of a historical figure. An investigative journalist managed to secure a rare interview where Julian, looking noticeably diminished, was pressed about his most significant achievements. He spoke at length about the technical brilliance of the film they made together, describing it as his zenith. When asked about Ilara specifically, he paused for a long time. Then, in a moment captured perhaps too clearly by the roving camera, he muttered something about her having been too fragile for the legacy I built for her, framing her departure as a failure of her constitution, rather than a success of her will. Ilara heard this anecdote secondhand, delivered by a former colleague over coffee. She didn't react with anger or sadness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the narrative trap he was still trying to lay. She understood then that Julian could never truly see her as an independent agent. To him, she would always be the tragic, broken artifact necessary for his monument. Looking out the cafe window at the vibrant, messy street life she now embraced, Ilara felt a sense of profound pity for him, trapped forever by the necessity of his own grand, self-serving legend. Her life was now defined by what she chose to create, not what someone else demanded she endure. The story was hers now, written frame by careful frame, far beyond the reach of any director's controlling vision. The quiet pity Ilara felt for Julian was the final, necessary emotional release. It signaled the complete dissolution of any lingering emotional debt. She understood that his insistence on her fragility was his last-ditch effort to maintain authorship over her narrative, to suggest that her independence was an accident born of weakness, rather than a triumph of intellectual and artistic fortitude. This realization solidified her commitment to fostering environments of genuine, transparent collaboration. She took on a role advising a new film collective focused entirely on cross-media storytelling, emphasizing long-term artist development over quick, high-impact projects. Her contribution was less about technical filmmaking and more about establishing ethical frameworks. She championed contracts that included strict clauses protecting creative autonomy post-production, and she insisted on mandatory, unbiased mediation sessions for artistic disagreements, mechanisms Julian would have dismissed as bureaucratic intrusions on genius. Ilara's own artistic output began to embrace direct commentary on the dynamics she had escaped. She created a series of soundscapes, intricate auditory environments that layered seemingly disconnected sounds. The controlled breathing exercises she learned to manage anxiety, the rhythmic clatter of Julian's antique typewriter during late-night script rewrites, and beneath it all, the steady, grounding sound of ocean waves recorded during a brief, unmonitored vacation. These sound pieces were deeply personal, yet universal, allowing listeners to navigate their own experiences of pressure and release without the distraction of her face or her past fame. The industry itself subtly responded to her influence. There was a noticeable shift in how young actors spoke in interviews. They were more guarded, more vocal about the importance of separation between personal life and character demands. The cult of the tormented auteur began to subtly lose its mystique, replaced by a growing respect for sustainable, healthy working relationships. Ilara had not just built a new career, she had inadvertently helped shift the cultural expectation of mentorship itself. Years later, Ilara was approached by a major academic institution, not just to lecture, but to head a new institute dedicated to ethical creative practice. The invitation was the ultimate validation. Her difficult experience was now recognized as essential knowledge, a critical text for the next generation. Accepting the post meant stepping fully into a role of institutional power. But it was a power she wielded with transparent intent, focused entirely on prevention rather than reaction. She never saw Julian again, nor did she feel the need to check on his fate. His legacy, she understood, was sealed by his own refusal to grow. He remained perfectly preserved in the black and white image she had once been trapped within. Ilara, meanwhile, was living in full color, her narrative unbound and constantly evolving. She was no longer the artist Julian discovered, but the artist who discovered the true architecture of her own creative survival, a structure robust enough to withstand any future storm, whether it came from a demanding director or the unpredictable vastness of the world outside. The weight of academic leadership sat well on Ilara's shoulders, not as a burden of expectation, but as a mantle of responsibility she chose to wear. Her institute became known not for producing glossy, commercially driven projects, but for incubating artists who possessed an unnerving degree of self-awareness. She instituted a foundational course titled The Ecology of Collaboration, which treated artistic partnership not as a mystical union, but as a resource that needed careful, balanced management to prevent burnout and exploitation. Her students were trained to recognize the subtle semantic differences between constructive criticism and emotional siege warfare. Ilara consciously avoided the grand, bombastic pronouncements typical of artistic figureheads. Instead, her leadership was characterized by meticulous attention to detail in policy and unwavering support for the individual artist's right to say no. She championed transparency in financial arrangements and creative control rights, directly counteracting the opaque contracts Julian had utilized to secure his absolute dominance. This grounded, structural approach to art-making was her quiet revolution, a testament to the fact that profound, challenging work could indeed be born from respectful, well-defined processes. Her own artistic practice had evolved into something purely meditative. She began composing site-specific installations in natural parks, ephemeral works designed to decay entirely over the course of a single season. These pieces, often using materials that would harmlessly return to the earth, required rigorous planning regarding placement and environmental impact, but demanded nothing from the viewer except presence and acceptance of transience. It was the ultimate repudiation of Julian's quest for eternal, fixed legacy. Ilara understood that true influence lay not in permanence, but in the quality of the momentary experience shared. One day, while reviewing archival material for a historical seminar on directorial overreach, Ilara came across a brief, almost buried mention in an old industry trade publication. It was an announcement that Julian had passed away quietly several months prior, largely unremarked upon outside the tight circles of those who remembered his controversial heyday. The obituary, when it finally appeared weeks later in a major paper, was surprisingly brief, focusing almost entirely on his early avant-garde achievements, and notably omitting any mention of his later, more fraught collaborations. It read as if the most volatile, career-defining period of his life, the period that had nearly defined hers, had been redacted by consensus. Ilara read the short notice, feeling no surge of victory, only a quiet finality, like closing a very heavy, well-worn book. The space Julian had occupied in her psyche, once a gaping void of anxiety, had long since been filled with her own carefully constructed achievements. There was a small, almost imperceptible moment where she considered whether to attend any memorial service, but quickly dismissed the thought. Her presence would only serve to reaffirm the narrative Julian had so desperately tried to lock her into, the story of the tormented apprentice. Instead, Ilara walked out of her office and into the late afternoon sun flooding the campus quad. She watched a group of her students animatedly debating the merits of a shared storyboard, their voices carrying enthusiasm tempered by mutual respect. She saw the future, a future where art was made through a network of equals, not subjugated by a singular, consuming will. Ilara didn't need an obituary to define her ending. Her life was the continuous, unfolding script, written in her own hand, in a clear, uncompromising light. The quiet acknowledgement of Julian's passing brought Ilara a final, subtle clarification of her own journey. It underscored the reality that while he had sought to immortalize moments through the cold permanence of film, she had chosen a life built on continuous transformation and the gentle acknowledgement of impermanence. The erasure of their shared volatile period from his formal obituary spoke volumes. Julian, in his final act, could only canonize the parts of his career that upheld his myth of uncompromised genius, effectively silencing the period of destructive creation that had defined his relationship with her. Ilara recognized this final editing as the very mechanism of control she had spent years dismantling within herself. She continued her work at the Institute, refining the curriculum to focus on building resilience against the romanticized notion of the suffering artist. She introduced case studies that analyzed how industrial power structures co-opted genuine artistic vulnerability for profit, using examples that deliberately avoided naming names, focusing instead on the mechanics of the power imbalance itself. Her lectures became less about what happened to me and more about how we can build systems where this cannot happen again. Her personal artistic expression also deepened its commitment to the ephemeral. She began collaborating with environmental scientists, creating temporary, data-driven sculptures that visualized climate shifts over short timescales. These works were designed to be observed, understood, and then allowed to vanish under natural processes. The art was in the communication and the witnessing, not the preservation. It was an aesthetic philosophy utterly opposed to Julian's desire to fix human experience in amber. The contrast between their two artistic trajectories became a quiet metaphor within the cultural landscape. Julian remained a fixed point of reference, a historical warning, while Ilara became synonymous with adaptation and ethical innovation. Students who came to the Institute were often well-versed in the story of the controversial director and his muse, but their focus was invariably on emulating Ilara's ability to emerge whole, not on replicating the dramatic tension that characterized Julian's rise and fall. One evening, while preparing a keynote speech about artistic legacy, Ilara stumbled upon a rare early interview Julian had given just before they met, a time when his influence was still rooted in genuine, almost rebellious idealism. In that interview, he spoke passionately about democratizing film, about making the camera an extension of the common eye. Reading those earnest words, Ilara felt a fleeting pang, not of longing, but of recognition for the young man who had once believed in the purity of creation. It was a reminder that even the most destructive figures often begin with a sincere, albeit ultimately corrupted, vision. She closed the laptop, the harsh blue light disappearing. Ilara understood that her final victory wasn't surviving Julian, but in being able to look back at his ambition, the sheer force of his desire to impose meaning, and choose deliberately and consistently a different kind of life, one built on shared meaning, not solitary conquest. She walked to her window, the city lights below a complex, interconnected web, no longer seeing it as an indifferent monolith, but as a vast, ongoing conversation in which she finally held an articulate, self-directed voice. The story wasn't over. It was simply being written now in a language free of external direction. The articulation of that self-directed voice was perhaps Ilara's greatest achievement, a calm resonance that cut through the manufactured noise of the industry. She found that genuine authority wasn't about demanding silence so others could hear your pronouncements, but creating an environment where every voice, even the quietest, felt safe enough to contribute its truth. Her institute, now thriving, had developed a unique fellowship program where established artists were paired with emerging voices specifically to teach the mechanics of setting and maintaining creative boundaries, effectively institutionalizing the wisdom she had paid for in personal exhaustion. Ilara's public persona solidified into one of measured authority, marked by an almost regal simplicity in her attire and mannerisms. She favored tailored monochromatic clothes in deep blues and forest greens, colors that spoke of depth and stability, a conscious departure from the high-contrast, performative visuals Julian had favored. Her face, once etched with the strain of emotional recall, now carried the gentle lines of deep concentration and well-earned peace. When she smiled, it was a slow, deliberate unfolding, entirely genuine and never calculated for a camera flash. The ongoing work on the ephemeral installations provided her with essential grounding. Her pieces, often created in remote locations, accessible only after significant physical effort, required her to engage with logistical realities far removed from soundstages and trailers. One such installation, built along a remote stretch of coastline to document the erosion patterns over a single tidal cycle, demanded that she spend weeks in solitude, relying only on her own resourcefulness. This physical, pragmatic engagement with the world reaffirmed her connection to tangible reality, a tether against the abstract, consuming manipulations of her past. The lingering cultural memory of Julian served an unintentional, passive role in Alara's narrative. He was the perfect foil. When critics occasionally tried to draw parallels, pointing to the artistic tension of their shared film, Alara would gently pivot the conversation. That project was a profound study in pressure dynamics, she would state calmly, and I am grateful for the intensity of the observation it provided. But an observation, however sharp, is not the same as a life. My current work is about the choice to inhabit the space after the pressure releases. She consciously fostered an inner sanctuary where the memory of Julian could not gain purchase. She stopped viewing their dynamic as a cautionary tale and began treating it as a solved equation, a formula for destruction that she had successfully inverted into a formula for self-sustainability. The raw, untamed grace Julian had once tried to bottle now flowed naturally, channeled not into performance for his gaze, but into the careful architecture of her own unfolding life. The final, definitive separation from the shadow came not with an event, but with the simple realization that she no longer thought of him. One morning, while sketching a complex interplay of light filtering through her office window, a purely self-motivated act of observation, she realized the mental landscape previously occupied by Julian's demanding presence was now entirely dedicated to the subtle variations of shadow and light in the present moment. He had required her to constantly relive the past to fuel his art. She now inhabited a continuous present, rich, complex, and entirely her own to frame. The director's shadow had finally dissipated, not because he had vanished, but because Alara had finally stepped into her own, unextinguishable light. The stark, almost unsettling aesthetic of Screenity immediately announces a departure from conventional cinematic comfort, establishing a mood that mirrors the protagonist's internal fragmentation. This visual language, characterized by its relentless focus on the digital interface and the subsequent erosion of the physical world, owes a clear debt to early digital cinema auteurs, though filtered through a distinctly contemporary lens of omnipresent surveillance and curated online identities. The film operates less as a traditional narrative and more as an extended, unsettling observation of mediated existence, functioning almost as a contemporary analog to the anxieties explored in the works of certain European art house filmmakers, grappling with technological alienation in the late 20th century, albeit updated for the smartphone era. The central figure, whose journey through various screens forms the spine of the film, is intentionally rendered as an archetype rather than a fully fleshed-out individual. This deliberate flattening forces the viewer to project their own digital anxieties onto the character. We see echoes of actors known for embodying detached, highly controlled personas in neo-noir thrillers, where the performance is not about emotional outpouring, but meticulous control over presentation. If we consider the subtle nod to the career trajectory of certain independent actors who transitioned from niche, performance-heavy roles into broader, though still intellectually rigorous, mainstream projects. The choice here seems to be a conscious rejection of easy empathy. The actor's previous work, often involving highly stylized movements and minimal dialogue, serves as a perfect foundation for this near-silent, purely reactive performance dictated by the glow of the device. The film's structure, fragmented by notifications, loading bars, and deliberately jarring cuts between different applications, mirrors the cognitive load imposed by modern digital life. This relentless pacing feels less like a directorial choice for dramatic effect, and more like an honest transcription of attention span erosion. It speaks to the influence of experimental montage techniques, specifically those that sought to disorient the viewer into a state of heightened awareness, reminiscent perhaps of early Soviet montage theory. But here the rhythm is dictated not by revolutionary fervor, but by the demands of algorithmic engagement. The director's background, rumored to involve substantial experience in motion graphics and high-end commercial design, a world where clarity and immediate impact are paramount, manifests here as an almost terrifying proficiency in manipulating visual expectations within confined screen dimensions. One cannot ignore the philosophical undercurrents, particularly when viewing the film through the lens of its evident inspirations. There are significant echoes of artists who explored the nature of constructed reality and performance, not just in cinema, but in conceptual art, where the act of documentation becomes the event itself. Think of how certain documentarians, initially celebrated for their objective gaze, later pivoted to works overtly questioning the ethics of observation. Screenity seems to be asking, when every moment is framed for external consumption, what remains of the internal life? The visual motifs, the constant refreshing of feeds, the endless scrolling, are not mere filler, they are the action. They suggest a profound fatigue born from the necessity of perpetual self-curation. Furthermore, the film brilliantly uses sound design to underscore its thesis. The cacophony of pings, chimes, and autoplay snippets serves as the true antagonist. This soundscape is meticulously crafted, drawing on the work of sound artists known for their immersion in urban noise pollution, transforming the intimate space of the viewer's headphones or living room into a hostile communication hub. The silence, when it occasionally breaks through, is heavy with implication. The silence of disconnection, which is framed not as peace, but as a terrifying void where identity ceases to be validated. The commitment to this relentless auditory environment reflects a deep understanding of how technological saturation redefines the baseline of sensory normalcy. The final impression is one of beautiful, self-inflicted suffocation, a perfectly rendered portrait of a life lived entirely through reflections. The emotional landscape of Screenity remains stubbornly flat, which paradoxically makes its depiction of contemporary anxiety so potent. The protagonist, whose face is rarely seen outside the harsh blue-white illumination of a handheld device, embodies a specific kind of modern numbness. It is the fatigue born not of hardship, but of relentless, low-grade stimulation. We sense a lingering shadow of former enthusiasm, perhaps a failed creative endeavor, or a relationship that dissolved under the weight of shared digital documentation, suggested only by the jerky hesitation before a certain application is opened, a brief pause that feels monumental in this otherwise fluid stream of interaction. This hesitation hints at a character whose ambition was once directed outward, perhaps toward traditional artistic pursuits, before the immediate gratification loop of the screen proved too addictive to resist. One might imagine this individual having harbored aspirations similar to those directors who started by meticulously crafting short, intense visual essays, only to find the attention economy demanded a different kind of performance. The film's decision to eschew traditional dramatic arcs forces us to look closely at the micro-expressions caught in the peripheral vision of the reflected screenlight. These flashes, a slight tightening around the eyes when a message is ignored, a momentary stillness of the hand when a desired connection is finally made, are the only clues to an internal life actively being suppressed. This performance style requires an actor capable of conveying depth through near invisibility, drawing comparisons to the minimalist actors favored by certain European minimalists who specialized in portraying alienation through stillness rather than movement. The character isn't actively sad or happy. They are merely existing in a state of perpetual reception, waiting for external input to assign them value. The relationship dynamics, when they surface, are entirely filtered through text, voice notes, or highly edited video clips. These exchanges are devoid of true vulnerability, constructed instead from the most functional, least revealing language possible. The film suggests that the very act of communicating online has trained its users, including our protagonist, to treat emotional exchange as a series of solvable puzzles or necessary data transfers. The fleeting image of a partner, often seen blurred in the background of a selfie or heard as a tinny voice over an open channel, serves as a ghost of authentic intimacy, a life that exists parallel to, but never fully intersects with, the illuminated world of the screen. The inspiration here seems rooted in the stark psychological realism of early 90s independent cinema, which focused on the crippling isolation found even within crowded urban environments, but amplified by the isolating properties of digital proximity. The recurring motif of the battery indicator ticking down becomes a metaphor for the protagonist's own finite reserves of authentic presence. The panic induced by low power is not merely practical, it is existential. When the screen dims, the curated self vanishes, leaving behind an uncomfortable void that the character seems utterly unequipped to fill. This mirrors the career anxieties of modern creatives who feel their worth tied entirely to their online visibility metrics. The fear that if the network goes down, the self dissolves. Screenity captures this beautifully, presenting the charging cable not as a necessity, but as a life support line tethering the individual to their constructed reality. The entire composition breathes a silent critique of the hustle culture that demands constant visibility, illustrating how the drive for professional success has become inextricably linked to this exhausting, narcissistic performance of perpetual availability. The director's hand, subtle yet insistent, constantly nudges the viewer toward recognizing the performative exhaustion underpinning the protagonist's every interaction. This exhaustion isn't the sharp fatigue of physical labor. It's a dull, pervasive spiritual drain stemming from maintaining an unsustainable level of digital self-monitoring. The character's movements, when captured outside the context of typing or swiping, are often hesitant, as if unaccustomed to occupying physical space without the mediation of a device. There's a specific awkwardness in how they hold a coffee cup or navigate a doorway, suggesting a physical muscle memory atrophy analogous to the mental atrophy caused by outsourcing decision-making to algorithms. This echoes the subtle body language noted in documentary studies of individuals whose primary work environment is entirely virtual, forcing them to relearn the etiquette of the tangible world during rare necessary excursions. We can infer a background of high-achieving, perhaps overly mentored adolescence from the protagonist's inherent need for validation, now channeled entirely into digital metrics. This is not a slacker. This is someone who once thrived under structured feedback, only to find the feedback loops of social media, likes, shares, rapid-fire comments, are both infinitely available and profoundly shallow. The few moments where the protagonist attempts a task offline, like sketching in a notebook or trying to read a physical book, are characterized by a visible inability to sustain focus. The eye instinctively flicks toward the pocket where the phone rests, anticipating a vibration that never comes in the analog sphere. This inability to settle suggests an early career trajectory, perhaps aimed at complex, long-form creation, maybe novel writing or classical composition, that was abandoned when the market demanded instantly digestible content, a shift many established artists in the late 90s had to begrudgingly navigate as digital platforms emerged. The color palette reinforces this emotional austerity. Scenes set in the physical world are washed out, often dominated by muted grays, or the sickly yellow of inadequate indoor lighting, visually communicating that the protagonist perceives reality as inherently less vibrant than the screen. Conversely, the screen itself explodes with oversaturated, hyper-real colors, the aggressive reds of breaking news alerts, the perfectly rendered turquoise of a filtered landscape photo. This disparity creates a constant, low-frequency cognitive dissonance. The world we see as real is dull. The world the character inhabits is captivating but false. This visual metaphor powerfully mirrors the career path of certain photographers who, having mastered the technical perfection of studio lighting, found themselves unable to find beauty in natural, uncontrolled light, preferring the predictable mastery of the artificial environment. The film never offers catharsis, which is perhaps its most emotionally challenging stance. There are no moments of true rebellion, no dramatic phone smash. Instead, the climax is often signaled by a simple system update forcing a temporary suspension of access. An enforced moment of silence that is met not with relief, but with palpable distress. In these brief respites, the character's face, stripped of the screen's glow, appears pale and strangely vacant, like a statue momentarily unveiled. This void is the central emotional core of Screenity, the terrifying realization that the self has become so intricately woven into the digital fabric that removing the fabric means the self unravels. The film ultimately portrays a life where the ultimate achievement is not happiness or fulfillment, but simply remaining perpetually logged in. The deliberate narrative opacity surrounding the protagonist's origins only serves to deepen the film's commentary on modern identity construction. We are not invited to sympathize with a backstory, but rather to observe a self meticulously constructed in the present tense of the feed. This echoes the philosophical explorations of certain postmodern thinkers who posited that identity is purely a collection of enacted performances, and Screenity acts as a rigorous, unforgiving demonstration of that theory in practice. The character functions as a living critique of the influencer economy, yet without ever directly satirizing it. The horror stems from the absolute sincerity with which the performance is executed. The viewer recognizes the mechanisms of branding and self-optimization, but watches helplessly as the protagonist applies these commercial tools to their entire existence. Consider the few instances where the protagonist interacts with physical artifacts, a forgotten passport, an expired library card. These objects are handled with the same detached curiosity one might afford a museum piece. They represent a past life, perhaps one requiring foresight, commitment, or vulnerability, all qualities actively edited out of the current digital persona. If this character were an actor, their breakthrough role would have been one demanding intense immersion in a role requiring emotional unavailability, perhaps a corporate spy, or a highly successful but deeply cynical tech CEO, roles where emotional distance is a survival mechanism. Here, that mechanism has become the default setting for living. The director's masterful use of negative space within the frame further emphasizes this isolation. Often, the physical environment surrounding the protagonist is pushed into deep shadow or rendered indistinct, suggesting that the world outside the four corners of the screen lacks dimension or consequence. This contrasts sharply with the meticulously rendered detail on the screen, the crispness of a freshly sent emoji, the sharpness of a notification banner. This visual hierarchy dictates the character's psychological priority. Only that which can be instantly quantified or broadcast holds sensory weight. It is a visual language that critiques the sensory bias of our time, inspired perhaps by cinematographers known for using extreme contrast to delineate psychological states, where light itself becomes a character representing the false allure of validation. The implied relationship with technology itself is one of servitude disguised as empowerment. The user taps the glass not to control the device, but to plead for its continued attention. When the screen freezes, a moment of technical failure, the protagonist's physical reaction is immediate and primal, a sharp intake of breath, indicating panic over the loss of the scaffolding of their self. This dependency goes beyond mere convenience. It suggests a complete outsourcing of self-regulation. The film implies that the protagonist has internalized the logic of the operating system. If it is not loading, it is not happening. If it is not posted, it did not occur. This is the ultimate evolution of the surveillance society, where the subject willingly becomes the most diligent guard of their own confinement, driven by the internal command structure of the network they inhabit. The pervasive feeling of inauthenticity is skillfully woven into the fabric of the sound design, moving beyond mere irritating notifications to suggest a deeper pathology. The voiceovers, often snippets of highly curated podcasts or motivational speakers, play constantly in the background, providing an unceasing stream of prescribed positivity that clashes violently with the protagonist's inertia. These audio tracks serve as the internalized voice of the external world, constantly setting unattainable standards for productivity and well-being that the character clearly cannot meet, yet dare not turn off. This mirrors the career anxiety of professionals who feel compelled to consume self-help and business literature relentlessly, believing that absorption of information equates to actual progress. The protagonist's attempts at self-care, when visible, are exercises in documentation rather than genuine restoration. A brief shot of someone consuming a brightly colored, nutrient-dense smoothie is immediately followed by a close-up of the device, focusing on the act of photographing and filtering the image before the first sip is taken. The nourishment is secondary. The presentation of nourishment is everything. This speaks to a generation raised on visual rhetoric, where the process of verification by an unseen audience outweighs the intrinsic satisfaction of the activity itself. Even moments of apparent leisure are meticulously scheduled and itemized, suggesting a relentless optimization of time that ironically leaves no time for genuine repose or unstructured thought, a concept perhaps familiar to early proponents of extreme time management techniques who saw leisure only as necessary fuel for the next bout of work. The recurring imagery of reflections, in darkened screens, polished windows, or even the highly reflective surface of a new piece of hardware, is never flattering. These reflections are distorted, elongated, or momentarily obscured by dust, functioning as momentary glimpses of the real, unedited self that the protagonist actively avoids confronting. When the protagonist does look directly into a reflective surface, not connected to a device, their gaze is evasive, suggesting a profound shame or unfamiliarity with their own unmediated presence. This contrasts sharply with the confident, smooth gaze adopted when recording a direct-to-camera message, where the eyes are sharp, engaged, and performing sincerity for the lens. The film's climax, if one can call it that, arrives not with a bang, but with a slow, almost imperceptible degradation of image quality, a low bandwidth mode kicking in without warning. Suddenly, the vibrant digital world becomes muddy, pixelated, and slow to render. The protagonist's reaction is less fear and more a weary resignation, as if this technical failure is the only appropriate final state for a life lived at such unsustainable resolution. This slow-motion collapse suggests that the character, much like a poorly optimized piece of software, has overloaded its own system. The final fading image, perhaps a frozen frame of the protagonist mid-scroll, suspended between one notification and the next, leaves the audience with the lingering sense that this digital purgatory is not a temporary phase, but a permanent state of being, meticulously chosen through thousands of small, unexamined taps and swipes. The protagonist's hands, often the only fully visible part of their physical form, besides the face illuminated by the screen, display a nervous energy that betrays the calm facade projected through the digital interface. They are constantly fidgeting when idle, drumming silently against the edge of a table, or rapidly rotating a small object, a pen, a coin, in the spaces between required digital actions. This kinetic undercurrent suggests a deep, unexpressed frustration, a physical manifestation of the psychic dissonance between the life being performed and the life being endured. One can almost feel the residue of manual dexterity lost to continuous flat interaction. The dexterity required for intricate physical tasks has been replaced by the highly specialized, repetitive motions of digital navigation. This mirrors the career evolution of artisans who transition to digital reproduction, where the intimacy with material is exchanged for scalable efficiency, often at the cost of tactile connection. Emotionally, the character seems trapped in a state of anticipatory dread. They are never fully present in any moment, because they are always preparing the next iteration of that moment for broadcast. If a genuinely moving piece of music begins to play through their headphones, the immediate impulse is not to absorb it, but to find the perfect visual accompaniment or the most poignant caption to accompany the experience for others. This preemptive archiving of experience crushes the organic unfolding of feeling. It's a subtle form of self-sabotage, rooted in a belief, perhaps instilled early in their development by demanding mentors or hypercritical parents, that an experience only gains true validity once it has been publicly validated. This points toward a personality type that seeks external metrics for internal worth, a trait often found in individuals whose early successes were tied heavily to standardized testing or quantifiable achievements. The fleeting glimpses of the outside world, a rain-streaked window, the shadow of a passing pedestrian, are framed to appear menacing or, at best, irrelevant. The physical environment is portrayed as stubbornly resistant to the clean, immediate interactivity offered by the device. When the protagonist does venture out, their posture suggests a temporary exile. They walk with an almost apologetic slump, head tilted down, as if trying to minimize their physical footprint while constantly scanning the periphery for a signal strength bar or an accessible Wi-Fi network. This physical withdrawal is the ultimate symbol of their commitment to the constructed reality. The world requires effort, while the screen offers frictionless engagement, even if that engagement is corrosive. The film's dedication to portraying the protagonist's loneliness without offering sentimental solace is its most profound achievement. There are no tears shed over lost love or missed opportunities. The loneliness is colder, more clinical. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of connections, yet understanding that none of them require any genuine sacrifice or commitment. The characters' friends are merely avatars whose engagement levels dictate their perceived importance. When a connection inevitably fades, a follower count drops, a direct message goes unanswered for an extended period, the reaction is muted, a small dip in the ambient background noise, rather than a sharp emotional break. Screenity argues that continuous low-level digital noise ultimately deafens the capacity for genuine emotional response, turning even profound solitude into a manageable, if tedious, data stream. The character is not actively suffering. They are simply optimized for a system that has no module for authentic human contentment. The sheer labor involved in maintaining this state of optimized non-being is a recurring visual theme, subtly communicated through the micro-expressions of fatigue around the eyes and the rigidity of the neck muscles, even in repose. This isn't the relaxed posture of someone resting. It is the strained tautness of an athlete perpetually waiting for the starting gun. The protagonist appears to be constantly performing micro-adjustments, leaning slightly to catch the best light, subtly shifting their body position to avoid a distracting reflection on the glass. This suggests an ingrained professional hazard for someone whose career, real or desired, demanded relentless visual performance. A silent nod to the burnout experienced by early internet personalities who had to pioneer the standards of constant on-camera presence without the established support structures of modern production teams. The few times the protagonist interacts with food, it is treated as a necessary, almost embarrassing interruption to the workflow. Meals are consumed one-handed, often while continuing to type or watch content, emphasizing utility over pleasure. The chewing is mechanical, the swallowing quick, reflecting an attitude where the body is merely a biological system requiring infrequent maintenance to keep the primary interface functioning. This minimization of corporeal needs highlights a core theme. The digital self has successfully colonized and marginalized the physical self, viewing embodiment as an inefficient barrier to productivity. This echoes the ascetic disciplines sometimes adopted by figures in early computing or radical minimalist movements. But here the discipline is not self-imposed for enlightenment, but externally coerced by the logic of the screen. The use of screen-within-a-screen compositions, a video playing inside another application window, or a live stream being monitored while composing an email, creates an infinite regress of mediation. The viewer, like the protagonist, loses the anchor of a singular reality. We are always looking at a layer removed from the source, much like the protagonist seems incapable of experiencing an event without first filtering it through a digital lens. This layered approach is conceptually similar to techniques employed by filmmakers fascinated with memory and unreliable narration, where the structure itself becomes the subject of questioning, but here the unreliability is technological rather than psychological. The flaw is in the medium, not the memory. Furthermore, the film subtly critiques the architecture of the devices themselves. The sleek, seamless design, which promises unity and effortless function, is revealed to be a highly restrictive cage. The protagonist is confined by the screen's aspect ratio, by the standardized icons, and by the programmed pathways of the software. When an application crashes or a link breaks, it's not just an inconvenience. It is a momentary confrontation with the brute materiality of the technology that holds their entire identity captive. This vulnerability hints at a deeper fear of obsolescence, the anxiety that the next software update or the next hardware iteration will render their meticulously curated online self instantly archaic, a fear deeply embedded in the careers of those dependent on rapidly evolving digital platforms. The film is a portrait of perfected, highly polished stasis, where the only movement is the relentless, ultimately circular, motion of the scroll. The protagonist's sleep patterns, or rather, the aggressive disruption thereof, serve as a stark barometer for their deteriorating psychological state. The brief periods of unconsciousness are frequently punctuated by the reflexive reach for the device, even without an incoming notification. These midnight awakenings are not driven by immediate threat, but by the abstract terror of missing an emergent digital event, the fear of falling behind in a race whose finish line is constantly being moved. When finally asleep, the face, briefly seen without the screen's harsh blue cast, is slack and strangely vacant, a landscape momentarily cleared of the urgent demands of performance. This contrasts violently with the alert, almost predatory focus maintained during waking hours. This oscillation between hypervigilance and profound collapse suggests a burnout rate far exceeding that of traditional high-stress professions. The mind is never truly at rest because the self remains perpetually on call. The film avoids showing any significant interpersonal conflict with family or old friends, implying that these relationships have either atrophied to mere perfunctory exchanges of emojis or have been entirely purged from the protagonist's curated sphere. The few contacts listed in the device, often labeled with functional monikers rather than names, are treated with the same detached efficiency as managing email inboxes. This emotional pruning is a calculated strategy to reduce variables and maintain the streamlined narrative of the digital self, a ruthlessness perhaps learned from the cutthroat efficiency demanded in highly competitive, data-driven industries where personal connections are often viewed as liabilities to objective decision-making. The rare instances of genuine, unprompted curiosity, a close-up on a detail in a painting visible on a distant screen, or a momentary focus on a fascinating cloud formation outside the window, are always quickly overridden. The protagonist's thumb hovers, then decisively swipes past the object of interest toward the next pre-programmed distraction. This points to a profound, self-inflicted cognitive bottleneck. The capacity for deep, sustained aesthetic engagement has been traded for the breadth of superficial awareness. They are drowning in input, but starved of meaning. The inspiration for this depiction draws heavily on early cinematic explorations of mass media saturation, where the endless repetition of images led to a desensitization that this film updates for the interactive age, where saturation is personalized and constant. Moreover, the film uses the visual language of user error, the accidental deletion of a photo, the mistyping of a crucial password, to reveal vulnerability. These moments of technical failure trigger disproportionate bursts of panic, suggesting that the protagonist's ability to correct real-world mistakes is significantly diminished. They are adept at navigating digital rollback features and undo commands, but lack the resilience to face the permanence of physical error. The sheer fragility of this constructed existence is exposed when the device battery finally dies, not in a dramatic shutdown, but through a slow, flickering descent into blackness. In that final darkness, the silence is absolute, and the character remains frozen, an actor waiting for a stage light that will never return, embodying the ultimate critique of a life lived in deferral. The very texture of the air within the protagonist's immediate environment seems to vibrate with an unexpressed anxiety, a constant, low-frequency hum that only the viewer, privy to the film's sonic tapestry, can truly appreciate. This invisible pressure dictates the protagonist's pacing. Their movements are rarely fluid, instead characterized by a series of short, sharp accelerations and decelerations, mimicking the jerky nature of buffering video or an unstable connection. It suggests a deep-seated mistrust of stillness, a belief that to stop moving, even digitally, is to invite erasure. This mirrors the psychological state of individuals who have built their entire professional identities around volatile market trends, where yesterday's success is instantly irrelevant today. The protagonist's interaction with mirrors is highly ritualized. Before engaging with the camera, there is an almost ceremonial adjustment of posture and expression, a final check to ensure the physical vessel aligns with the projected avatar. This brief ritual suggests an almost theatrical background, perhaps years spent striving for perfection in disciplines where external presentation was paramount, ballet perhaps, or competitive public speaking, where the body was trained as an instrument of projection. Now, that instrument is operating under a malfunctioning score. The face, when caught in the brief respite between notifications, reveals a subtle asymmetry, a slight trembling in the lower lip that hints at a highly disciplined suppression of disappointment stemming from the gap between expectation and digital reality. The film's critique extends to the very aesthetics of digital language. Emojis are not used for simple expression. They are deployed as emotional placeholders, efficient shorthand for complex feelings. The protagonist no longer seems equipped to articulate verbally. A heart emoji substitutes for intimacy, a fire icon replaces passion, and the reliance on these symbols illustrates a linguistic regression. This echoes the work of certain conceptual writers who intentionally stripped language down to its most basic, transactional components to reveal societal artifice. But here the stripping is involuntary, a side effect of platform design. The character defaults to iconography because genuine prose feels too slow, too traceable, too risky. When other human voices penetrate the protagonist's auditory bubble, perhaps a co-worker on a video call or a distant relative on speakerphone, they sound unnaturally loud, almost alien. The protagonist responds in the same clipped, over-articulated cadence used in their text messages, struggling to modulate tone for unmediated conversation. This suggests that the protagonist has spent a critical developmental period immersed in text-based communication, rendering the nuances of real-time vocal interaction awkward and exhausting. The director brilliantly captures this through the protagonist's tendency to stare intently at the speaker's face on screen, not to gauge sincerity, but to diligently monitor the speaker's lip movements, as if reading subtitles for an unfamiliar language. Ultimately, Screenity presents a terrifyingly plausible future where the performance of life supplants life itself. The protagonist is not a victim in the traditional sense. They are a dedicated employee of their own curated image, diligently executing a job description that demands perpetual self-exposure without requiring genuine connection. The final, lingering shot, perhaps focusing on a single, perfectly centered cursor, blinking impatiently on a blank document, leaves the chilling impression that the only true narrative remaining is the potential for the next keystroke, the next scheduled broadcast, the next validation loop to begin anew. The emotional vacuum is complete. The apparatus of connection has resulted in absolute isolation. The very act of viewing Screenity becomes an act of complicity, mirroring the voyeuristic contract the protagonist maintains with their unseen audience. The camera placement is often deliberately intrusive, mimicking the angle of a hidden security feed or a peer recording a casual moment without permission. This directorial choice forces the audience into the uncomfortable position of being the outside observer, the very entity the protagonist is simultaneously trying to satisfy and evade through their performance. One feels the weight of this gaze, recognizing that every detail, every discarded wrapper, every flicker of despair caught on screen is being cataloged and judged, not just by the fictional audience, but by the viewer in the theater. This meta-commentary on viewership draws inspiration from early surveillance art that questioned the ethics of the observer's role in defining reality. The protagonist's digital artifacts, the carefully preserved screenshots of past achievements, the curated playlists meant to define their taste, serve as anachronistic anchors in their fluid reality. These are not mementos of happy memories, but necessary archival evidence designed to prove competence to a skeptical, ever-changing network. If one were to trace the protagonist's career aspirations back, they might point toward fields requiring extreme credentialism and public review, areas where a spotless digital footprint is essential, such as high-stakes finance or complex academic research. The current diffused digital existence feels like a compromise, a retreat from a specific, demanding public arena into a broader, more amorphous one, where failure is harder to pinpoint, but success is equally fleeting. The rare moments where the protagonist attempts creative expression outside the established feedback channels, a hastily written note in a physical book, or a brief, unedited vocalization, are immediately abandoned or overwritten. The analog mark is too permanent, too prone to human imperfection. The digital space offers the supreme comfort of version control. Everything can be deleted, edited, or simply ignored by the algorithm. This preference for editability over authenticity speaks to a deep-seated aversion to finality, a desire to keep the self perpetually in beta testing. This avoidance of finality is a defining characteristic of modern professional culture, where continuous development is fetishized over completed mastery. The film's most haunting emotional beats occur during automated system responses. A reply from a service bot, an automated confirmation email, or a pre-programmed birthday greeting from a distant connection are treated with a startling level of focus. These non-human interactions seem to generate a perverse sense of safety because they require no emotional expenditure from the protagonist, yet they confirm the system is still functioning, that the connection, however superficial, remains live. This reliance on artificial responsiveness suggests an individual whose fundamental attachment needs have been rewired to seek confirmation from infrastructure rather than other complex, unpredictable consciousnesses. It's the ultimate expression of technological sublimation, where the need for love is replaced by the need for uptime. Screenity concludes not with resolution, but with diffusion. The narrative simply thins out, the screen brightness slowly fading not due to battery loss, but as if the protagonist has finally achieved a perfect minimalist integration with the background hum of the digital environment. The boundaries between the character, the screen, and the viewer dissolve into a unified field of light and noise. This ending eschews the dramatic promise of escape, suggesting instead that this self-imposed digital containment is the terminal stage of contemporary identity, a successful yet utterly hollow optimization for a world that only values what can be immediately quantified and reflected back. The enduring feeling is one of exhausted immersion, a perfectly calibrated numbness achieved through relentless engagement. The film's dedication to illustrating the protagonist's declining capacity for deep focus manifests in its handling of time itself, which seems to stretch and compress according to the demands of the device. Long stretches of mindless scrolling pass in what feels like seconds, while a single crucial system loading bar, a symbol of external control over the protagonist's pacing, is agonizingly drawn out, occupying minutes of screen time. This temporal distortion reflects a mind that has become completely externalized, its rhythm dictated not by biological necessity, but by server response times. This echoes the psychological reports on long-term space mission personnel who struggle to readjust their internal clocks upon returning to environments with normal temporal flow, suggesting the protagonist is experiencing an existential gravity shift. The visual language surrounding the protagonist's physical appearance, though minimal, is telling. When glimpses of their body are afforded outside the screen's influence, a hand reaching for a glass of water, the subtle arch of the back while sitting, there is a suggestion of pallor and a lack of essential vitality, as if the body itself is running on low-power mode. The skin appears almost translucent under the cool, artificial light, a metaphor for the erosion of the tangible self beneath the hard veneer of the digital projection. This physical depletion is a powerful counterpoint to the supposed connectivity the character seeks. The more connected they are digitally, the more disconnected they become from the basic needs of their own physiology. One can imagine this character having once harbored aspirations rooted in physicality, perhaps as a dedicated athlete or a hands-on craftsman, aspirations now entirely undermined by the sedentary nature of their current existence. The protagonist's internal dialogue, inferred through their carefully selected search queries and the subjects of the articles they skim, reveals a desperate, disorganized search for meaning that always terminates back at the screen. They are researching philosophy, self-improvement gurus, and conspiracy theories with equal, shallow intensity, not to build coherent understanding, but to generate new, temporary content topics or to fill the silence between interactions. This pattern suggests an underlying intellectual hunger that has been hijacked by the short-circuiting reward system of quick information hits. The search history becomes a roadmap of existential wandering, revealing a soul attempting to troubleshoot its own sense of purpose using tools designed for navigation, not introspection. The few moments where another human presence briefly intrudes, a delivery person at the door, a neighbor calling their name, are handled with a sudden, almost violent abruptness. The protagonist reacts with visible irritation, pulling the phone away from their face as if exposed by a sudden flash of light. This highlights a learned aversion to unscripted, uneditable reality. Real-world interruption demands immediate, holistic engagement, which the protagonist is no longer capable of providing. They can only manage transactional, segmented engagement through their interface. The filmmaker implies that this character has become addicted to the buffer zone provided by the